Welcome back, everybody. If you're new here, my name is Douglas Johnson. I am a certified yoga teacher. I teach meditation. I do inquiry, spiritual counseling. I also do some sound healing and kirtan. So if you're interested in things related with spirituality, self-improvement, things of that nature, being truly happy and healthy, I think you'll find you're in the right place. So today I wanted to discuss a topic that I'm thinking of calling this video, Why the Ego's Plan Won't Work. And this is how most of us are approaching happiness, finding happiness in our lives. Most people are doing this unconsciously, so they haven't even stopped long enough to think about, what is my approach to happiness? How am I thinking happiness will come into my life? If you've never done that, I'm going to suggest right now that you do that. Maybe you even pause this video and look at, what is my plan for happiness? What do I think would make me happy? So if you're like most people, the plan is something like this. I love the beach, so my plan is to move to the beach. And I'm not saying that that wouldn't have any impact on your happiness, but you'll see why in a moment why this really isn't a strategy for long-term happiness. Short-term, the contrast of maybe you live in a stressful big city and you're stressed out and you're unhappy. So you in your mind, your ego creates this idea, okay, I'm going to move to the beach and all will be well. This is usually the unconscious driver that we have. We set up these goals, not consciously, unconsciously, and the ego is doing this for us. And we sort of are led. So we think, okay, I need to move to the beach. Okay, well, how do I do that? Okay, I'll start saving now and I'll apply for jobs and whatever it might be. So we're driven toward this goal of moving to the beach, and there's this sort of unconscious subtext that once I do that, happiness will ensue. And indeed, in the short term, that may happen. But as we'll explore, this really can't last very long. Now, I hope that everyone can appreciate and understand that the beach is just an example. You might be thinking, once I find my partner, then I will be happy. Once I have a family, then I will be happy. Once I get this promotion, then I will be happy. Once I get whatever it is. But what you find is every time you achieve one of these goals, for a brief time, you may be happy. And when I say brief time, that might mean a day, it might mean a week, might mean a month, might even mean a year or two even, depending on what the situation is. But what you will likely find is sooner or later a sense of dissatisfaction comes back in. In Buddhism, this is called dukkha. And it's sometimes translated, that word dukkha, sometimes translated as unsatisfactoriness. Sometimes it's actually translated as suffering. And one of the basic tenets of Buddhism is that all life is suffering, and Buddhism is meant to be the cure to suffering. All right, so all of this all of what I'm describing, moving to the beach, getting the partner, creating a family, all these things, these will create suffering unless we have the cure, because these are all part of life, right? All life is suffering, and these things are not any exception to that rule. So what's going on here? How come it is that whatever the goal is, whatever things I achieve, it seems like the goalpost is always moved ahead? That I am working toward moving to the beach, and I move to the beach, and I'm not saying don't move to the beach. I'm not saying don't get a partner. I'm not saying don't get married. I'm not saying don't have a family. The mistake is in thinking that will lead to happiness. We usually think that will solve my problems, but what we find is any of these will come with their own set of challenges and problems, and our desires will just return. While we're focused on this one desire, we might find that we don't desire other things. But once that's satisfied, then we'll find that other desires very quickly come in. And most of us have multiple desires anyway that we're working with any given moment. So what's going on here? Well, there is a biological explanation for what's going on, and it's called hedonic adaptation. The principle or the idea is that our nervous system is built like the rest of us to adapt. So if I am experiencing a lot of pleasure from something, my nervous system will actually start to tamp down that pleasure over time. It will start to dull that pleasure. And so what was once a almost maybe ecstatic experience of, oh my goodness, like let's say chocolate cake, right? Or let's go back to the beach example. Oh, I wake up, I'm on the beach, oh, I feel so alive, this is amazing. Day 2, oh, it's so amazing. Week 2, oh my gosh, I'm just so grateful, I finally made my dream come through, right? Year 2, I really like living at the beach, but we start to find other, oh, there's a hurricane again, and last time there's a hurricane, I had this and that, and there's erosion under my house now, and the beach maybe doesn't feel as good. We take that deep breath of salt air, and it just doesn't have the same kind of effect, right? Or again, chocolate cake. Let's go back to chocolate cake. That first bite of some amazing chocolate cake that we take, oh, this is so amazing. And then if we indulge in that, at a certain point, we will actually feel like, I don't want any more chocolate cake, right? If we were to sit down and I said, we're just going to keep eating this chocolate cake. We're going to keep eating it. You love it so much. Just more. Let's have more. And we keep having more and more. Eventually, you're just not going to want any more chocolate cake, okay? I would presume, even if it were like every meal, if I were to say, oh, we're going to have chocolate milk every meal, we're going to sit down, or chocolate cake every meal. So, hedonic adaptation. This is why drugs and alcohol don't work. Drugs and alcohol, they will temporarily seem to dull the pain of our past trauma, which we may or may not be aware of. However, over the long term, we will need to take more and more substance in order to have the same sort of dulling effect and pleasurable effect. So it just sort of ramps up over time. It's less and less effective. And this is where we end up, where eventually the cure, so to speak, starts to become the problem. And this can be true of yoga as well. This is something that I've not really heard anyone else talk about or speak about, but I like to speak about it because it's something that I see. We can become addicted to yoga in the same way. We go to that first yoga class, we're in Shavasana, we feel a sense of freedom and peace that we've not felt before, and we assume more of this is what I need. And in a short-term perspective, you might be correct. And even in a long-term perspective, if we're really talking about yoga, not just asana, not just postures, but we're talking about yoga, then yes, yoga can lead you to lasting peace and joy. That's really what yoga is for. But most people approach yoga in a hedonic way. So again, today's talk is really about hedonic adaptation and why the ego's plan won't work. Why it won't work is because at a very basic level, the ego's plan is pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Okay? It's very simple. And again, if you haven't already taken a moment to explore in your own mind, what is your strategy for happiness? Long-term happiness. It is generally like trying to avoid the minefield of unpleasant things, right? I don't like traffic, so I try and avoid traffic. I don't like cocktail parties, so I try and avoid cocktail parties. I don't like, insert whatever your dislikes are, and I try and avoid that. So this is addressed directly in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. He tells us that in order to experience yoga, we need to let go of something called raga and dvesha. Raga is my desires, and dvesha is my aversions, okay? So he's telling us right there that if I do not let go of my aversions and my desires, that I will not experience yoga. Now, I find that people interpret this in what I would consider a bit of a silly way. And they think that somehow they're going to extinguish all of their desires and they're somehow going to stop being adverse to certain things, certain situations. And in my experience, I don't know that this is possible. Maybe some people say that it is, or that they've achieved that. I would question that. I would want to maybe have a conversation with someone like that and maybe actually do some poking and prodding to see if this were really true. So I don't think we need to take these statements completely literally, and we don't need to take them to an extreme. From my perspective, what Patanjali is doing is cautioning us against being led by our desires and our aversions. Now, from a biological perspective, the strategy of avoid unpleasantness and maximize pleasure won't work is one, it's not really possible to avoid unpleasantness, is it? It really doesn't matter how much money or success you have. This is going to be near impossible for you to just avoid unpleasantness. Even like turning on the news, you may not like the situation, what's going on around the world, or maybe hearing about how the environment is treated really upsets you. Well, it really doesn't matter how much money you have. You alone will not be able to change that situation, will you? You can maybe, if you have a lot of money and influence, you can maybe take steps in that direction. But it's not like you can snap your fingers and make something like global warming go away, or the political situation disappear. So what you'll find is no matter how much money you make, there will still be things that you're adverse to, things that you don't like. Maybe people treat you in a certain way that you don't like, right? Maybe you want your parents to respect you and appreciate what you've done and how much money you've made and how much influence you have, and then you find that they just don't. So maybe you want someone to fall in love with you, and they don't. Money is not going to solve that problem for you. Money, influence, power, right? And so the other side of it is also true. As I've already explained, hedonic adaptation. If I say I love steak dinners, if I could just have steak every single meal, I would be happy. I think most of us, once we become an adult, we already know this is not going to work. Children very often don't realize that because the parent is actually keeping them from learning a lesson, which is, again, my biology, my body. I can try eating or binging on something, and then at a certain point, I'm going to start to feel sick in the short term. And then in the long term, what I'll find is there are adverse effects on my physiology, on my body. So things like metabolic disorders, diabetes, things of that nature, obesity, these things are the result of, again, thinking that more of what I enjoy is going to bring me pleasure. And again, there is a subtle thing happening here, which is that for some people, the unconscious driver is actually trauma and pain. And so this is where you find the natural sort of circuit breaker, you might say, to hedonic behavior gets broken. It doesn't work as it should. And so what we find is that somebody might actually keep eating foods that are really not good for them and then end up with diabetes or obesity. Whereas somebody who is healthy, who hasn't been traumatized, then they naturally will sense, ooh, I really don't feel very good anymore. The reason for this is simple, okay? And it has nothing to do with character. It has nothing to do with being a good person. The basic equation is that if the pain of that past trauma is at a certain threshold, then even though the way that I self-medicate through overeating Doritos or ice cream or whatever it is that I might do, that hedonic pleasure behavior, even though that might cause negative side effects, the pain of my past trauma is so great and so high that the negative side effects are not enough to really register. They don't really make a huge difference for me. So I hope that is clear. If you have someone in your life with addiction, addictive behavior, and again, you can even be addicted to yoga, although yoga has the potential to actually lead you away from addiction. And this is the main difference, that alcohol, there's no point at which your bartender is going to sign you up for a recovery program or something like that. It generally, the situations and the people that you will be surrounding yourself with and indulging in that, you have to hit bottom before you might turn around. But that has worked for many people. Actually, it's worked for some of my teachers, where once they truly hit bottom and began looking for real change, real answers, when they were ready for that, then they began to create significant change. So even with something like alcohol and drugs, this can actually happen. But with yoga, it could be, first of all, yoga is a less harmful way to self-medicate, generally speaking. Yoga is actually good for you in many ways. So even though you might be using meditation or yoga to self-medicate, to try and dull the pain of the past trauma, generally the effects are much more benign and generally beneficial. So unlike alcohol, which really doesn't have a beneficial effect other than we could say maybe a social one, or dulling the pain of past trauma and abuse, yoga is going to have many, many benefits. However, like anything, dosing is important. So again, if I need a lot of asana postures to dull the pain of my childhood abuse or mistreatment, trauma, and again, trauma comes in big T and little t. And I think we all emerge from childhood with some of it. You might think that the big T is more impactful or more important than the little t. I don't really see it that way currently, just FYI. So if you have some little t traumas from, say, your mom or dad coming home from work and yelling and screaming at you because they had a stressful day, that's likely still impacting you as an adult to this very day. It's impacting the way that you relate with your partner, if you have one, with your children, if you have them, how you relate with your boss, your coworkers. So it's pretty much going to affect everything in your life. And if you don't think it is, it just means you're just not really aware of it. Now, these things generally need to be handled in one way or another, okay? And this is a lot of the work that I do with people when they are ready. I try and help them work through this past trauma, big or little. I try and give them the tools that they need to do that and the support that they need. So when we do that, we find ourselves relating with things differently. And that will include things like yoga and spirituality. So it's not uncommon at all for people to get involved in spirituality with the idea that this will help me escape my pain. This will help me escape this life. This will help me escape what I'm feeling. And I'm sorry to break it to you, but that is addictive behavior. Full stop. That is the very driver of addiction. I can escape this with that. Spiritually speaking, what we want to do is stop trying to escape. This is tricky. It requires quite a bit of awareness. And what we'd like to do is jump into the experience we're having. We really want to live life fully, and life is a yin-yang affair. It is a sweet and sour experience, if you will. So again, the idea that I can arrange my life so that there's no salty, right? There's no unpleasantness, the Vaisha. There's only what I want all the time, just pleasantness. What you'll find is that that experience, if that is your motivation, then I think we have plenty of examples of people who have had immense success. They seem to be living the dream, and yet we know that they were or are miserable. Okay, so rock stars, they get all this money, they get all this success, they get all this recognition, they can have as much sex as they want, and yet we find their addictive behavior getting worse and worse and worse, right? What's going on with that? So again, this is just one example of how we can seemingly have everything handed to us on a platter, and it will not scratch that itch. So the thrust again of today's talk is this idea of hedonic adaptation, which is our nervous system, our biology will actually keep turning down the volume on pleasure when there's too much of it. We get numb to it. We stop really experiencing it in the same way. You may have, again, had an experience of a first time experiencing something and it being almost out of this world, otherworldly, and you think, this is the answer. I need more of this. Again, it could have been on a yoga retreat. Spirituality, it's very common. Now, I want to be careful about discouraging those who need these tools from using them. So I am bringing up examples where spirituality can create the same issue or problem. But for many people, if spirituality is what is drawing you in, at least with a teacher like me and some other teachers who are aware of this trend, you're in good hands. If you are not with a teacher that's aware of this, then you may be happier and healthier than you would have been as a drug addict, but you're never going to experience liberation. And maybe that's okay. Liberation may not be for everybody. So for some people who, given their karma and their life path, it's just them being able to live a relatively happy and healthy life and not end up overdosing or hurting others. Maybe this is the best possible outcome. So again, I don't want to decide what is right for everybody. But usually for people who are going to work with a teacher like me, even if early on they are tempted to approach what I'm offering in that same sort of addictive way, I will, over time, with talks like this one, try and encourage them to not develop that relationship with these practices. That does not mean, I want to be clear, does not mean, I'm not saying stop going to class. I'm not saying stop listening to these talks. I'm not saying stop going on retreats. I'm not saying stop do your practices if you're meditating or doing some other practice. Okay? So this is more about what's going on up here. It's more about our attitude towards things, our approach to things. It's less about what we're doing. And what we find is when we sort things out up here, what we do starts to follow suit very naturally. So hedonic adaptation. Whatever I find pleasure in, whatever I enjoy, whatever gives me that hit, over time, I will find I get less of it. And again, I've seen this in yoga classes. I have a friend who's also a meditation teacher, yoga teacher, and she likes to say, you get 2 years of asana bliss. And she's probably correct about that. It's something I've observed and I think it's about right. You see people new to yoga, they come, and after maybe a few classes, or maybe even the first class, or maybe after a few weeks or months, they're wide-eyed at, wow, I feel so amazing, and I've stopped drinking, and I've started eating better, and I'm losing weight, and it feels to them like I found the answer and the solution to all my problems. And enjoy it. In a sense, there's nothing wrong with it unless you get stuck there. And so what I find with some students is, because it was yoga postures or asanas in which they first experienced this high, what they start doing is, instead of diving deep with the teacher who taught them the asanas and the postures, instead of going down, they go across. Okay? So hopefully this makes sense. So instead of saying, okay, yoga asanas, postures, which is really a beginner's practice, if you're not with a teacher that has more to offer you than yoga postures, or thinks that yoga postures are some kind of advanced tool, and I'm not saying they can't be used in more advanced ways, but they're used with other practices, okay? If you're with a teacher who is advertising that yoga postures are going to take you to the liberation and freedom and happiness that I speak about, you might want to really examine that. You might want to look for another teacher, I'm sorry. So instead of working and going deep with the teacher, what these people do is they go sideways. So they find another teacher. They find a different kind of asana or posture. Ooh, let me do this other one. This is more complicated and difficult and fancy. And they may temporarily, like the addict, let me try this other drug. Let me try more of the drug I'm using. They may temporarily get a hit, get a fix, right? They recapture that feeling. That it's very much like love and romance, right? There are people who, they fall in love and then they drop down into that experience with that one person. And the love deepens and grows, and it's a beautiful thing. And then there are people who go sideways, right? Once that hedonic pleasure of being with this person, the new relationship energy, once that starts to wear off, they get rid of that person and they start up with another person. And then same thing happens, and it's over and over and over again, rather than picking someone and then diving deep. So ideally with yoga, if you are one of these hoppers or skippers, and I'm saying this for your benefit, I'm not saying it to serve me, because I very well may not be your teacher. I may not be the person who you are meant to sort of dive deep with, but I can still help you. And the way I can help you is see if you can find someone, a full range teacher. They may not even be that good at teaching asana. From my perspective, that's not that important. You want someone who really is good with meditation, who's good with inquiry, who's good with the psychological parts of it, who's good with energetic work. If you can find someone like that, my advice would be to try and start going deep with them. Realize that they're human and they will disappoint you. They will do very human things that might annoy you and irritate you. It doesn't mean they can't still help you or guide you. Just like a cab driver, you may not like them, but they might still be able to get you where you're going, right? So there's a difference between a cab driver who you may not personally like and a cab driver who's actually taking you somewhere you don't want to go. So you might love your cab driver but they're actually taking you to the wrong place because they don't know how to get where you're wanting to go. Okay, so this is what I would like you to understand about teachers. We may not be in love with our teacher, and yet if they know how to get us where we want to go, we ideally want to stick with that teacher. Versus, oh, I just love this person. They're so bubbly. They're so energetic. Their personality is effervescent. And then we find, well, they don't actually know how to lead me where I'm wanting to go. And this happens quite often because charisma is different than spiritual knowledge. There are people who have immense spiritual experience, knowledge, a lot of compassion and love. And yet, if you were to see them on YouTube or on Instagram, you would just keep going, okay? And then the opposite is also true. There are people who have tons of charisma. They just draw you in, and they're actually vapid. They really don't have much to offer you, spiritually speaking. So, ultimately, what I've found is the deepening of our spirituality, our experience of the joy of being, the love that comes from being. This is not subject to hedonic adaptation. Or if it is, it can continually be deepened in a healthy way. Again, let's go back to chocolate cake. There's only so much chocolate cake I can eat, either before I get sick of eating it or I find that I am physically sick. Same with alcohol, same with drugs, take your pick, whatever it is. There's only so much we can do before our physical body actually really can't handle anymore. With true spirituality, though, I find that this very subtle love and joy and compassion of being, I have not found that it can be exhausted or that there's an end to it. And I am aware there are other teachers who proclaim the same. So I suspect, I can't prove, because if you're looking into a bottomless well, what seems to be a bottomless well, and as far as you can go, you don't find a bottom, you can't prove there's no bottom. You just know that you haven't found it. So I can't say, oh, this goes on infinitely forever. All I can really say is I haven't found a bottom to this experience. And it just keeps paying dividends. The effort, the work we put in to lay the spiritual foundations for our life, the trust we have in our guides and teachers, this pays off unlike anything else I've experienced in this life. Another thing that is perhaps somewhat similar is developing one's talent, say musically. This is another thing that I found cannot be exhausted. One can always potentially become a better musician or deepen their experience in some way. I do want to caution you against creating a sort of acquisitive nature around this. I had a conversation with a good friend recently where we were speaking about a spiritual community in which we were both involved at one point, and we both agreed that there eventually came into that community a sort of acquisitive nature I need to acquire something. I need to acquire this or that. And that brings in what's called the spiritual seeker. And in my experience, the spiritual seeker is something we really need to be aware of and cautious about, because it does not tend to take us where we want to go. So even though I'm speaking about this potential to continually deepen this experience, and that's a very real experience for me, and I want to share it with you, I still encourage you to approach these things in a light and playful manner with not too much seriousness. It's tricky because, yes, you do have to devote time, energy, and maybe even money for guidance, for the resources. Most people do anyway. So on the one hand, I really want to encourage you to give it your all, right? To take it seriously, to do as much as you can. And at the same time, I have to encourage you to be light and playful. And if you've been listening to me for any time at all, this perhaps shouldn't come as any surprise. The balance of yin and yang is present in this teaching as it is in all teachings. So do we need to take our spirituality really seriously and pursue it with vigor and energy? Yes. Do we need to be light and playful and not take things too seriously, our spirituality too seriously? Yes. Yes to both. Yes and. It's not an either or situation. Some of you, maybe if I were talking to you personally, I might say you need to lighten up. You need to take it a little easy. You need to be a little more playful with your approach to this. And then someone else, I might say the opposite. I might say, I think you need to take things a little more seriously. You need a little more discipline. You need to up your practices or be more regular in your practices. This is like anything. If we're really working with a good coach or doctor or professional in any field, this is one of the things that they will help us gauge or judge for ourselves. If we're really open and we go to them and we say, what do I need to do? Then they can help us see what needs to happen as a give us an outside perspective. All right, everyone. So I hope today's talk was helpful. As always, I'd love to hear from you. So please leave me a comment. Go ahead and say hello. Tell me about your experience with this. I do want to thank my patrons on Patreon. They make these talks possible. If you'd like to join that community, check out the links below. If you're watching this on Patreon, thank you so much for your support, for your love. Until next time, everyone, namaste, and have a beautiful day.